The next and final honoree goes into a relatively new induction category, perhaps reserved for the best of the best. We've heard references not only today, not only the last couple years of the Cowboy Hall of Fame, but certainly for many, many decades about this next individual. If we hear anything about the Schnell family, he was a big part of it. Right now, it's my pleasure to introduce Mr. Bob Schnell, who will provide the introduction for this year's Great Westerner honoree.
Thank you, and I do want to say that I'm very proud to be able to speak on behalf of Ray Schnell. Ray was born in 1893 to immigrant parents that homesteaded near Richardson, North Dakota. He married in 1918 to a Norwegian school teacher from Minnesota that came out to teach in western North Dakota. And he always said that that was the smartest move that he ever made. In 1924, Ray started a lifelong career as an auctioneer. He sold a lot of sales during the 1930s, and they were closeout sales, they were foreclosure sales, they were heartbreaking sales. And I know that many times he absolutely would not accept an auctioneer's fee for selling those sales. You know, people like to go to sales that Ray Schnell sold. I think y'all know that he had a great sense of humor. They came to those sales to be informed and entertained. And of course he was a great salesman and became what was probably the most prominent auctioneer in the state of North Dakota. One of the early things that he perceived and saw on the horizon, and an indication of his foresight, there was a lack of a good marketing program for cattlemen, not only in North Dakota but throughout America. And as a result, he was one of the founders of the Dickinson Livestock Sales, really the first volume market in the state of North Dakota. I think there was maybe one other auction market started a year or so before that. But it was formed in 1937. And you know, I was only 7 years old when that first sale was held. But I can vividly remember just what went on. They bought the old fairgrounds, the old Stark County Fairgrounds, the big old barn, and they put a woven wire fence around the west side of it so they could facilitate the movement of cattle. And my older brothers, Raymond and Howard and Willard, moved the cattle in and out of the ring, and of course Ray was the auctioneer. And my older sisters, my mother, they ran the office. And of course the office was a couple of 2x12 planks across a double horse stall. Pretty humble beginnings. Raymond tells me that there was probably about 40 head of cattle and maybe a total receipts of about $5,000 in that first sale. But things grew. It was a family operated operation, and you compare it to the market now at Stockman's, where they'll sell as many as 4,000 or 5,000 head a week that are valued at somewhere at today's prices around $2 million. So pretty humble beginning that grew into North Dakota's largest livestock market. One of Ray Schnell's highest priorities on his agenda in his marketing years and his early years was to improve the cattle, especially in his trade territory. And to do that, he sponsored stock shows and sales. He paid prize money for good cattle. He judged shows throughout America. He bought a lot of bulls from breeders throughout the country and shipped them back here and sold them to ranchers in this area for cattle improvement. In fact, there were several years when Ray owned and sold more purebred bulls than any other person in America. There was a rather unorthodox method of herd improvement that was employed, and some of you older people might remember that. When we built the new sail pavilion in Dickinson in 1947, among the prizes that were awarded was prizes for the 3 poorest bulls that came to the sale. Now that's pretty, you just wonder about that, and you think about the publicity that might have gathered. And no, the consignor's name was not given, and there was a catch to it. He had to take that money and invest it in a purebred bull. And think about that for a minute, and you can think of all the inferior bulls that were weeded out of the country. Ray Schnell was a horseman. He was born and raised in a horse family, and he spent a lifetime owning and raising good horses. And I can remember back in the 30s when we had some government remount stallions from Fort Robinson, and we raised horses for the cavalry, and I can remember the cavalry when they came to pick their horses. Later on we had paints and palominos, and then after World War II he went to Albert Mitchell's ranch in New Mexico and selected a couple of crops of filly colts, and he became one of the very first and probably the largest quarter horse breeder in the state of North Dakota. Along with the horses, Ray always had a deep involvement in rodeo, and it dated back to his early days as a rancher in Richardson, North Dakota, where they sponsored rodeos. And of course it was culminated with the Match of Champions in Dickinson, and later on, of course, here at Home on the Range for Boys. And that was kind of his brainchild. He started that in the 1950s, and it was mentioned previously here today. Rodeo fans from 10 states and Canada would tell you that that was probably the greatest rodeo they've ever seen. And you can remember it, some of you older people, especially those first rodeos. They had great horses. In order to get those greatest cowboys in America, we had to offer the biggest single day's purse for any rodeo event in America. It was just a nationwide search for the very top bucking horses. And I can remember the Two Courses and Fettigs and Harley Ross and John Steen and Earl Zumwalt and some of the people that provided those horses in the early days. You can remember the names. I can remember. It's nearly 50 years ago. But I remember Whiz Bang and Figure 4 and Old Fitzgerald, and Indian Sign and Gray Wolf and some of the great bucking horses that they talked about here earlier today. It was quite an event. It was quite an event. The greatest cowboys, of course, were there, and including our own North Dakota cowboys that ranked high in world standings year after year. And you know who they are. The Tesher boys, Dean Armstrong, Alvin Nelson, Dwayne Howard, Joe Chase, and lots more that were very prominent at that time. You know, the Match of Champions was really the inspiration and the forerunner for the National Finals Rodeo. And you know what kind of a success that event has enjoyed. Father always had an intense interest in the people and the events that built the West. He always thought it was a priceless heritage that we just simply couldn't lose. And to advance that end, he and other folks from 17 western states founded the National Cowboy Hall of Fame and Western Heritage Center, located in Oklahoma City. You know, he really lived, and he was the chairman of the site committee that selected the site. He was the founding trustee of that organization. He gave the main speech at their kickoff banquet when they set the thing up. And I know from living with him that it was a great part of his life. He slept it, and he ate it, and he breathed it, and he felt it, and he lived it every day. And it kind of reminds me of the story that they tell at that time. I don't know if it's true or not. But in Dickinson, there was an old fella died that he was about the worst kind of a person you could imagine. He was dishonest. He was sloppy. He was a cheat. He was a drunk. Just about every bad attribute you could place on a man was that particular person. Didn't have many friends. But he died, and they had to bury him. He belonged to this particular church, and they were conducting the service, and the preacher that was to deliver the eulogy, absolutely speechless. And finally, in desperation, he said to the congregation, would any of the members of the congregation wish to say a word about our departed? And there was dead silence in the church. And finally, Ray Schnell was in the back of the church, and he jumped up and he says, well, Reverend, if you're not going to talk about him, I want to tell you about the Cowboy Hall of Fame. And the Dallas Morning News, in an interview with my father, were pretty impressed when he said that a ranch is the very best place to raise children. And they quoted him when he said that no boy or girl is going to go astray, that follows the path of a horse. About 30 years before that, Will Rogers said that he said there must be something really wrong with a man that doesn't like a horse. And I'll tell you what, my father liked horses. You know, some people compared Ray Schnell with Will Rogers in many respects. They even looked alike. Notice their pictures, they did look somewhat alike. In 1963, he was named the Man of the Year in North Dakota Agriculture. In 1965, he was named the Stockman of the Year in America at the National Western Stock Show in Denver. And you know, being from an immigrant family, and of course settlers that were impressed with the freedoms and the opportunities that presented themselves in this great land, and he had a political philosophy that if you live and raise a family in this country, you ought to take an interest in your government. And he did take a vital interest in government, and he served 6 terms in the North Dakota legislature. He was elected lieutenant governor in 1951. You know, with 13 children in the family that were born to Ray and Claire Schnell, you know, many of us grew up in the drought and the depression years of the 1930s. But I would say that we were taught the virtues of hard work and the dignity of manual labor, and I'll guarantee you we had to work. There was no other way around. But I would say also that he provided all of us with an education and the inspiration to succeed in whatever endeavor we engaged in. In a telegram that was sent to my mother upon the occasion of my father's funeral in 1970, United States Senator Milton R. Young said, and I quote, "Ray was one of the greatest citizens North Dakota ever produced. He richly deserves the nationwide recognition he received in so many fields." In my lifetime experience, my father, Ray Schnell, was the most decent man I ever knew. Thank you.
I'm Gordon Schnell. On behalf of the Schnell family, I want to thank everyone. I want to thank the trustees of the North Dakota Cowboy Hall of Fame that selected him to this great honor. I want to thank all of those who voted for him and everyone who came here today to this program. This is a great honor for him and for our family. I wish he could have been here to experience this. I'd like to have the family members stand up that are, first of all, my sister Oral, and I have 4 other brothers besides myself here, Raymond and Willard, and Bob is up here, and Jerry is right over here. So there's 6 of us that are here today. 1 brother and 2 sisters could not be here. I'd like also, there's quite a few grandchildren and great-grandchildren. If you would all stand up, please. The final thing I'd just say about my dad is that it was a great experience to have grown up in a family like that, where he was really the epitome of a lot of good things. And that was really the great one thing I'll never forget is how positive he was about things. He was never negative. He was never against anything. He was in favor of doing good things. He wanted good cattle, he wanted good horses, he wanted good rodeos, he wanted good livestock markets, and he wanted good Western people to be around. And he loved the West, he loved North Dakota, and we're very proud of him. So thank you.